welcome all. Today we have friends from Hong Kong, from mainland China, and from all over the world. And first of all, you are welcome to switch on your camera so that we know we are not speaking to black holes. Yeah, we are happy. We would love to see your faces, that we can really communicate, have some real dialogues when we see your faces. First of all, my name is Alan. I am a professional consultant from the School of Journalism and Communication in the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And this is the first lecture in our Conversation with Communicators series. So tonight, we are glad to have Ian Johnson with us. Hello, Johnson. Hello, Ian. Ian Johnson. You see that, actually, Ian is just arrived in Singapore. This is a difficult time for journalists, especially the foreign correspondents and writers in China who are caught between China and the Trump governance. And as described in the title of our talk, Ian is a China hand. Ian went to China in the 80s and spent most of his adult life in China. And he had worked for the Baltimore Sun and the Wall Street Journal. And Ian has been a writer in the New York Times in the past decade, before he, among other journalists, was kicked out or expelled from China. And his writing focuses on religion, faith, and values. And he is a Pulitzer Prize winner, a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, and a winner of Stanford University's Sorensen Journalism Award. And tonight, Ian will tell us his story of successes and failures as a 20-year China hand. And you're welcome to ask questions and interact with us, with Ian, after his talk. Ian, your floor.
Okay, thanks everyone for attending the talk, such as this. I'm looking forward to giving you my take on working as a journalist over the past 35 years, off and on, 30 years off and on, including, but all in all, about 20 years in China. And then I'm looking forward to your questions, especially also. So yeah, I just arrived in Singapore, so I thought I would wear a batik shirt. This counts as formal wear in Southeast Asia, so I thought, okay, it's suitable instead of wearing a suit and tie. So I'll start out by sharing a PowerPoint, which I'll use to show some pictures and describe the different phases of my career, trying to draw out some points. Let me first do this and then start. So my few successes and many failures as a 20-year China hand, or in Chinese, people might say a 中国通. It's kind of funny because I think China hand and 中国通 are both kind of like derogatory terms in my view. It's kind of like a dilettante who knows a little bit about this and a little bit about that, or at least we used to think of it like that. When Chinese people flatter you, they'll sometimes say, "Oh, 你真是个中国通," which kind of is like a, you know, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Sounds like you know a little bit, like you know how to use chopsticks and stuff like that. Anyway, but I'm just joking. So we can, you know, look at this, and I think maybe through my experiences, I have been in China working for most of the, off and on, not the whole time obviously, but off and on for most of the reform and opening up era. I went to China for the first time in 1984 as a student. So that was just 5 years after diplomatic relations were normalized. So that's my student ID. And for people who think that the PRC has an amazing bureaucratic system, they often do, but they even make mistakes because they say my citizenship there is American, but at the time I did not have American citizenship. I was Canadian, but maybe the CCP had an idea that I would later naturalize and become an American. So I worked there, and I went there to study Chinese. And this is the comic relief. You know, there I am in my dormitory at Beida, Peking University, doing tourism at different sites around Beijing and China. And one of the key reasons I went there was to work on a senior thesis for the university, for my BA, which was on North American journalism in China. And the reason I wrote my thesis on this was the reason I picked North American was because for most of the PRC's history, there had been no Americans in China, but there had been Canadians who worked for the Globe and Mail, and many of their articles had appeared in the American media. So they were syndicated on the wire services. And so my senior thesis, I was curious, you know, what are the common mistakes that journalists make in covering China at that time in 1984? And so, as I say, it was on North American journalism in China. I interviewed a lot of journalists from the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, AP, Christian Science Monitor, Globe and Mail, others. And I think my conclusion, which is kind of funny because you can see some of this coming back over and over again, is that there was too much copycat work. And I think that was, in other words, journalists were writing the same stories. They were just basically looking at what other people were doing and then duplicating that. And I think that that's partially understandable because it was hard in the 1980s to leave Beijing. In fact, if you wanted to leave Beijing or Tianjin, you needed permission from the government. So if you wanted to just go to Hebei, even, let alone Sichuan or Tibet or someplace like that, you had to get permission from the government. So people were sort of stuck together. They were all living in these diplomatic compounds, these Waijiao Gongyu, that had just been built in the 1970s, like at Jianguo Minwai and Sanlitun, which is really one of the reasons why so many foreigners still live in that part of Beijing. And they sort of didn't interact with many Chinese people. It was hard to, because they were living in these compounds. They were surrounded, the compounds had guards from the People's Armed Police outside, and it was hard to get out and talk to people. If you wanted to go into a university campus or you wanted to do, you know, anything like that, it was often very difficult. You had to get permission, or the guard wouldn't let you in. So there were probably some pretty good reasons for doing that. But that was my conclusion, and I wrote that up as a senior thesis. It was not published. It was just something I wrote for my bachelor's degree. But these are interesting conclusions because actually, I don't want to jump all the way to the end of my talk, but these are some threads that you'll see going through coverage of China. And this is also a plug for, this is a book that CU HK Press just came out with, and I described some of this, the advantages of learning Chinese at that time in terms of my career. In this book, I have a contribution in the book. So I then returned to China from 1994 to 2001. And I worked for the Baltimore Sun from 1994 to the end of 1996. So a little over 2 years, almost 2.5 years. Then I worked for the Wall Street Journal from 1997 to 2001. And also I did other things purposefully that I think helped my coverage of China. I did volunteer work for a charity as well. So this is the Baltimore Sun. The Baltimore Sun does not look like this nowadays. Most, as you know, newspapers around the world have gone through a huge convulsion. They have seen their advertising revenues decline. The number of reporters who work at newspapers has declined dramatically. But back then, the Baltimore Sun had more than 400 people working in the news department. So reporters, editors, photographers, copy editors, all of that. So 400 people. This is not the biggest newspaper in the US, right? This is a medium-sized city. But it was quite typical for American journalism at the time that these regional newspapers had big bureaus. They had maybe 15 to 20 people in Washington covering all aspects of Washington, and they had foreign bureaus. They had 8 overseas bureaus. Now, admittedly, that's not a lot compared to how big the world is, but they tried to have people on every continent, in different countries, and they had somebody in China. And so they sent me there to be the China correspondent at that time. The Baltimore Sun was interesting for a couple of reasons. One was their instruction was, don't duplicate what other people are doing. In other words, we have wire services. We can use AP, Reuters, New York Times, Washington Post. Don't do what they're doing. Try to do other things that are not being covered by the big newspapers. And I think that was, for me, a liberating experience because I didn't have to cover everything. Of course, if the president came to visit China, and I think during my stay there, Clinton came to visit, of course you would write about that. If it was really going to be big news, you would still write about it. But most of the time, you were free. So this is to travel. And so that was the final admonition by my boss was travel. Get outside of Beijing and try to get, China's a big country. It's as big as a continent. It's like if you're in the United States and you spend all your time inside the Beltway in Washington or living in Manhattan, you don't understand what the United States is like. Similarly, if you're in China, you spend all your time in Beijing, you'll not understand China. And this is a time in the 1990s when China was getting easier to travel. There was still this restriction. In theory, we had to get permission from the local foreign affairs office of a province if we wanted to go there. So if I wanted to go to Sichuan, theoretically, I would have to send a fax, because back then everything was by fax, there was no email, to the Waiban, the foreign affairs office of the province, and say, oh, I want to come to Sichuan and write an article about blah, blah, blah topic. And then 2 weeks later, they would get back to you and blah. But as the 90s went on, it was easier just to get on an airplane or a train or a bus and just go somewhere. And as long as the authorities didn't catch you, it didn't really matter. So this experience was useful for me because I got to write about different topics that maybe one couldn't always write about if one were only covering the big news. So there's something on mental health in China. It was that kind of a topic. I got to spend a bit of time on it. This is back when newspapers had money. Advertising revenues were high. You see, they hired a photographer, Mark Leong, to go with me and take pictures. He's a very well-established photographer, now does photos for National Geographic and has done photo books. But back then, regional newspapers in the United States had the money to spend on editorial content. And this is true not just in the United States, but around the world, really. The internet had not yet really destroyed traditional mainstream media. And travel a lot. There I'm traveling in Xinjiang. It was quite interesting because if you wanted to go to a place like, say, Xinjiang, you had to go through the Foreign Affairs Office. But it's sometimes journalists get the idea that I don't want to know what the government's doing. I want to just find out my own. I want to go on my own and get to the truth, right? And I'll find the truth simply by going on my own. But sometimes it's quite useful to see things from the government's perspective because they're trying to show you the best, right? And sometimes if you see that this is what they think is the best, sometimes it's not that good. And I remember we traveled around to the Taklamakan Desert, to the oil wells. And we said, oh, we've seen all this economic stuff. Let's see a typical Uyghur market. And the government said, oh, okay, well, we can stop at Aqsa, in the city of Aqsa, and and we'll take you to a market. Okay, no problem. We'll take you to a market and you can buy some rugs or something like that. You know, typical foreign journalists want to buy stuff. And so we get to Aqsa, and then all of a sudden the bus is like, oh, we can't stop here. And they like immediately drive all the way 12 hours or something right back to Urumqi. And then we found out that there were riots in Aqsa that day. And so you could, you know, sometimes when the government's trying to show you the best thing, and this is the best thing is still there's a lot of problems going on. They wanted to introduce us to a Uyghur businesswoman. And we were supposed to meet this Uyghur businesswoman to show us how successful Uyghurs were. At the last minute, she canceled very unexpectedly. Well, this woman ended up, her name was Rabia Kadir, who's well known nowadays as a sort of leader of the Uyghur opposition movement. And she had just been put into detention. So when the government on the one hand is telling you, you know, everything's great, no problem, but then even if you're with the government, you can still see things. And I think it's useful to see things from the government's perspective, because the government it may be telling you, of course, it's telling you a story, but it's important to know what the government's story is. You can still go on your own. You have to go on your own and see things. But I thought at that time, something I think people don't do nowadays. Nowadays, the government doesn't offer these kind of trips. They don't interact with foreign journalists, and foreign journalists often don't try as hard, I think, to interact with the government or find out the government's point of view. In this phase, I thought there were a few pluses and minuses. There was advantages of being a generalist. I could write about everything. For example, as I say, mental health, the Taklamakan Desert or whatever in Xinjiang, and travel widely around the area. There was not that much breaking news in China back then. So I got to write about topics that were bigger trends that became important later, but were not so obviously important. So I wrote about Qigong. This became, of course, huge when the Falun Gong movement rose up at the end of the 1990s. I interviewed writers like Wang Xiaobo, his wife Li Yinhe, a famous gender studies sociologist. These are people that you don't often have a chance to talk to if you're focused on daily news all the time. The negatives of this time is I feel that because I could do anything, in some ways I was really a Zhongguotong. I didn't do anything particularly well. I went around and doing a bunch of different things. I was not encouraged to talk to newsmakers, so I sometimes missed important people. I was in China in the 1990s. I could have interviewed important people like Liu Xiaobo, but I didn't because I thought, oh, everyone else is interviewing him. I'm not going to interview him. And so I missed that opportunity, which is really stupid in hindsight. But I think this is a bit of a problem when you're working at a small organization. They give you, in a way, total freedom, and you don't know what to do with it that much. And I think this is sometimes a problem people face today when you're, especially if you're working on your own as a freelancer, you're not part of a structure. You don't have guidance. And this is a problem, something I often talk to young journalists about, that when they're starting out, it's important to have guidance. It's important to have mentors. It's important to have people who will help you progress in your career. And so working for the Baltimore Sun was great, a lot of freedom, but maybe in some ways too much freedom, not enough guidance, and sometimes I didn't know what I was doing. So then I worked at the Wall Street Journal, and there I am working at the Wall Street Journal, cranking out more structured daily news articles. Here I am at a press conference for Zhurongji. So a lot of typical, quote unquote, big news events that the Wall Street Journal had me cover. The old Wall Street Journal, and I would emphasize this is the way the Wall Street Journal was up until the mid-2000s, roughly up until Murdoch bought the newspaper, and I guess that was 08 or 09, maybe 07, 08, something like that. Rupert Murdoch bought the Wall Street Journal. Before then, the Wall Street Journal was quite different. It called itself a second read newspaper. So the idea was that people would read their hometown newspapers for news. So the Wall Street Journal was distributed nationally, It didn't have one geographic center. So if you were in Kansas, you might read the Kansas City Star. Or if you were in Los Angeles, you might read the Los Angeles Times. And in your office, you might buy the Wall Street Journal as a second read, as a secondary thing to read, obviously for business news, but not only for business news, also for covering politics, trends, and things like that. So the rule was, do not duplicate what other people are doing. Again, similar to the Baltimore Sun. And again, I found this to be quite liberating. So sometimes we had to cover big news events like Zhu Rongji having a press conference once a year. We had to cover that. But a lot of the time we could work on our own projects. This was the exact opposite of the Baltimore Sun. There were very long articles and there was very good editing at the newspaper. The editors had a rule when you were working on something. This is the opposite of what happens today. The golden rule was spend one more day that you think is necessary. So if you think, I'm going to go and report this story, I'm going to go to Sichuan and report this story on such and such a topic, I need 2 days. The editor didn't say, oh, do it in 1 day to save money. He said, no, spend 3 days. Spend the extra day. Do all the interviews you have to do in day 1 and day 2. Do all the interviews, blah, blah, blah. Talk to all the people, all the government officials, and then have 1 day where you just walk around town aimlessly. And they say often in that day, when you're kind of relaxed, your mind is open, that's the day that you'll find the really interesting article. Like you go there with a preconceived idea. It's like a scientist, right? You go there with a preconceived idea. I'm going to go to Chengdu and do an article about tea houses, right? And everyone does articles on tea houses in Chengdu. You go to Chengdu and you interview all the tea houses. Well, what's the tea house culture in Chengdu and all this stuff, blah, blah, blah. Sort of boring. And then on the third day, you walk around and you all of a sudden discover that Chengdu has a thriving gay scene. It's like the gay capital of China. But maybe you didn't know that. And then you go there and on the third day, you're just walking around talking to people and they tell you that, or you go to a bar and somebody tells you that. And then all of a sudden you realize, hey, that's an interesting topic. China has a gay scene. It's headquartered sort of in Chengdu. It's like the San Francisco of China. I mean, this is also not an original idea, but this is the sort of thing that you might not have realized that you would realize perhaps by walking around. So this idea of spend one more day, I even have a memo that the editors gave out for page 1 articles where they encourage you to spend more time. So this is again when newspapers back then had money. They didn't care if you spent another day in a hotel room, if you had to take the extra day away from the office. They wanted you to get out there and see things because they realized that even if you didn't get another story, you might just have more knowledge about the country just by going to a park or going to a temple or whatever. And so I think that was really a great lesson. And something I tried to do later in life, like don't get set into this preconceived idea. I think especially nowadays with digital media, we're all looking at each other's stuff on Twitter. We all think we know what the story is. And we're trying to be as efficient as possible because nobody's paying any money for anything. Oh, write an article, here's $200 or something crazy like that. And so you're trying to do everything as efficient as possible, not spend any time or resources on it. And if you can at all afford to, spend more time, not less. So this time I got to travel around a lot. These are snaps of me, whatever, various random places. With the kids setting off fireworks at Chinese New Year in the countryside. So they encourage you to go spend Chinese New Year with somebody in the countryside, even if you don't have a definite article to do. You may have some idea, you may come back with a story on agriculture in China, on infrastructure in China. You never know if you just get out of Beijing again. The pluses and minuses of that phase for me, it was a highly structured newspaper. First thing, no duplication. And second thing, all stories had to be approved by editors. And what do I mean by that is you had to write a pitch, a proposal not for a daily article. So if something happens today, there's no time because of the time difference. You have to just go write the article. But if there's something like, I want to go to Sichuan, I want to do an article on such and such a thing, you had to write to your editor and say, I'm going to write an article on this. Here's what I think it's going to be. I don't know exactly, but I want to go there and work on it. Do you agree or not agree? And you can negotiate, go back and forth. The good thing was, if they said, yes, we'll take that article, then they were kind of locked into taking it. Like you wouldn't just go somewhere and spend a week and then come back and they wouldn't run it. They had bought into your idea. And I thought that was actually a really good thing. That doesn't happen too much. A lot nowadays is people want things on spec. In other words, you write it first, we'll look at it and then see if we want it or not. The advantage of getting people ahead of time who will look at your articles, who will agree to it, is that they will probably run the article. So this was a highly structured newspaper, but I think in some ways in a good way. It encouraged people to take on big projects. For example, Falun Gong. In 1999, as you may know, I don't know, many of you are young, there were big protests in China by the spiritual group Falun Gong. In 2000, there was a crackdown. In March of that year, I think, or April, I started in March. In April, the Wall Street Journal ran an article of mine on a big article about Falun Gong. And the editor of the foreign editor said, okay, I want you just to focus on this topic for the rest of the year. So for the rest of the year, just focus on that topic. So I said, yeah, but I'm also covering China macroeconomics, and I'm also covering China's entry into the WTO. I mean, how can I only focus on this? And he said, no, we'll find somebody else to do that. You just focus on this and maybe help out a little bit on those other things. But that's the kind of advantage of being at media organizations at that time, because they had the resources to do that. Nowadays, few newspapers will do that unless they think they can win a prize. Nowadays, a lot of resources are only put at things that if they think they can win a prize or not. If they think there's no prize, they won't spend the resources. This is the unfortunate truth. The editing was excellent, and that got me to think about writing books. And then indeed, at the end of my stay there, I wrote a book that was published a little bit later in 2004 called Wild Grass, which was about civil society in China. The downside of this phase, of this kind of journalism, is there was a lack of freedom. I was working for a big organization, there were 5 other people, 6, and then later 6 other people in China, just for the Wall Street Journal. I had to cover a certain narrow area. I couldn't do other things. Other people had other things to do. And I was also more tied to the newspaper's standards, if you will. In other words, as long as the newspaper had high standards, it was fine. But as the newspaper's standards began to decline, especially I think after it was bought by Rupert Murdoch, you're also locked into that. You don't have, you are part of this big organization, and it's hard to get free from it. So in good times, that can be good. In bad times, that can be bad. I also did a lot of charity work at this time. I worked for a charity that helped rebuild Taoist temples. On the right side is an American businessman, Brock Silvers, who actually lives in Hong Kong now. And he started this charity to help rebuild temples. We collected money and donated money to temples that had been destroyed. And I got to know a lot of people, such as this nun, who became lifelong friends. The advantage of that, I think, is that I got to get out of the journalism world. I got to see other people, even if it didn't result in articles, and they didn't result in articles, but this is just important, I think, when you're analyzing a country, not just to look at it from a professional point of view. Sometimes it's important to have these personal ties, to know people who are not just going to be in your article. You know, that everybody isn't just to be used for your professional purposes. I think this is a problem that people have, especially journalists, that the moment they meet somebody, they immediately think, and their little minds are immediately going, can I use this person? How can I use this person? Is this person useful or not useful? If you're useful, I'm friends with you. If you're not useful, I'm not interested in you. I've met a lot of journalists like that. So I think it's important, if you're trying to really understand a country beyond just the daily work of whatever your profession is, I think having these kind of unofficial contacts with people is really important. So I came back to China between '07 and 2020 this year. I worked at the Wall Street Journal for another few years, up until 2010. Then I became a freelancer from 2010 to 2020. I was accredited for the New York Times. In other words, I got my journalist card and my visa for the New York Times, but I wrote for a lot of other publications also, such as the New York Review of Books. And I pursued projects more than daily news. So I didn't write that many daily articles, mostly did longer term things trying to result in books. I also taught, and I did more academic work, something I'm doing now, including a PhD. So the advantage of this, what I was hoping to do, was to work on longer term projects, such as this book I'm working on now on memory. This is a picture of somebody who had experiences in the Cultural Revolution. I got to formulate more of my own projects, and try to maybe combine the Baltimore Sun and the Wall Street Journal. In other words, I have more freedom, but I still try to have some structure and take on more longer term projects. This is just something on popular culture in China. Oops. Yeah, these are a series of Q&As I did. I still have this series going on, although I'm not in China anymore, with public intellectuals in China. Some of these people you may know, some of them you may not know. And this was something I think that a newspaper probably would not have supported. So over a decade, over 10 years, I interviewed about 35 people. They're still on the New York Review of Books website, and I got grant money to try to travel around China and go to different parts of the country to talk to different public intellectuals about the future of China, where they thought China was going, et cetera, et cetera. Pluses and minuses of this past phase. Again, I tried to combine the freedom that I had when I was at the Baltimore Sun with the bigger picture mentality of the Wall Street Journal. I was able to write one book and research 2 more books. I think the downside, unfortunately, is that this kind of work is incompatible with a staff job at a newspaper. Newspapers, especially for the Wall Street Journal, as I think it sort of declined over the past decade or so, less money, less staff, less time to spend on articles. I think it's incompatible primarily because newspapers have changed so much. Newspapers are now, for financial reasons, they don't have the same staff that they have before. They have fewer people. As you know, newspapers in the past used to have a lot of advertising that they could get for things like automobiles. Nowadays, if you want to buy an automobile, you don't buy a newspaper to look at the car ads. You go online and look and see online ads and reviews and stuff like that. Same thing for a lot of different products. So newspapers used to have a lot of advertising, used to have a lot of money. They don't have that anymore. But that's part of the reason. But I think also the rise of the internet and social media has meant that people are very aware of what everyone else is doing and kind of duplicating what other people are doing increasingly. So there's this feeling, I think, often that you don't almost have to be in a country to write about the country, because I can see everything on Twitter anyways. I can use Google Translate. I can read the blogs. I can read the newspapers online. Why do I need to go to the country? I can even interview people by WeChat or call people up on the phone or do a video interview, say by WeChat or something like that. Why do I need to be in China? And I think that this is the sort of mentality that's become increasingly common in the media, and I think in society in general, that you don't have to be in a place, you don't have to really understand anything, and you can understand it. Yeah, this is just sort of saying the downside of this is that basically, if you want to do this kind of work, there's no real financial security. If you're on your own, you don't get all the benefits of working for a big newspaper. Yeah, I did also teaching. These are some of my students that I had over the years, taking them to places around Beijing. This was important from a personal point of view because it helped me to see things through the eyes of younger people, which is always really a helpful thing to have. I think often journalists get a little too cynical, a little too jaded. They have a set of fixed ideas, and it was always great to have new students every year who had completely fresh view on China and help me see China with fresh eyes. And then I also, as my avatar, I also participated in a pilgrimage association. These are groups that perform at temple fairs this is in Beijing. And so I joined these groups and got to know people. And again, these were not people I wrote articles about, but they're people who I got to know over a long period of time. And they helped me, I think, understand, especially because a lot of these people are working class. And you could get to know a lot of working class people like that. And you could see what their concerns were, quite different from the kind of public intellectuals. So on the one hand, I talked to public intellectuals, these well-known thinkers and artists and writers and filmmakers and all that sort of stuff. On the other hand, I talked to these people who had very different interests and very different concerns and considerations. So that to me was a real grounding. It helped me also understand, for example, the support that the government, I think, has among many people. Sometimes people, if you talk too much to public intellectuals and dissidents, you might have a view that the government is not popular or etc. But when you talk to a lot of ordinary people in China, you could understand why somebody like Xi Jinping would be quite popular and the kinds of things that he did. You could see initiatives of the party at the grassroots level. And even if I didn't write about those directly, it helped me understand China more. So again, not just doing things for overtly a professional idea, like I want to go interview this person to write an article about them, but rather just try to get to know more different kinds of people. And then you'll understand the country better. I'll give you a very concrete idea. The guy there who's jumping in the picture, who looks like he's about to turn around and smack me with the stick. He is a friend of mine. He's a carpenter, retired carpenter, and he always was a big hobby historian of old Beijing, of Lao Beijing. He collected all kinds of stuff of old Beijing just on his own. And then later, as the government began to promote a traditional culture, he became a teacher at a cultural center in a part of Beijing. And then the Communist Party recruited him to join the party because they liked his work so much. This is a guy who already in his 60s was recruited by the party just because they liked the kind of work that he was doing. So you could really see the party on a very concrete level, shifting focus, embracing traditional culture, recruiting people like this into the party to try to promote culture and so on and so forth. And, obviously he had a very favorable view of the party. The party, being a member of the party gave him more money, better pension, all of these things that in the past were private hobbies of his. Now the government was supporting it, and he could teach young children in Beijing all about Beijing, hobbies and things like that, skills, music, songs, and so on and so forth. So you got a different view by engaging with people on this level. Yeah, I think how this helps, again, it takes I think one thing it also does is it takes the edge off life. A lot of times journalists have an us versus them relationship. And they'll say stupid things like, they'll sort of say, oh, I like the Chinese people, but I don't like the Chinese government. You know, like that's like an easy explanation for everything. You hear journalists would say this all the time. I like Chinese people, I don't like the Chinese government. And sometimes, you know, I can understand what they mean, but I think it's too simplistic to simply say the Chinese government has nothing to do with Chinese people. And that when you talk to people like that, I was just referring to, you can understand that the government has different sides to it, that it isn't all police coming in and arresting people, that you get an idea of the government's, that the government's agenda is actually quite nuanced and complex. And it gives you a greater appreciation, whether you like it or not, whether you think this is a good government or a bad government, a good thing or a bad thing. It makes you understand its strengths, I think, more, and its durability by seeing this kind of thing. And then you also, as I said, you know, so this guy is my best friend. He ends up, he's a Communist Party member now. So, you know, it's like, you can't say, well, I don't like the Communist Party, because now I know Communist Party members, you know, they're my friends. They're not all arresting Liu Xiaobo and doing stuff like that. I mean, it sounds simple, but I think sometimes journalists are so caught up in the moment of, I have to, you know, get the story and find out and find out and find out, that they almost never relax and just kind of like live in the country a little bit as a normal person. Just do some charity work. Just do something that is not related to work. I think that's true no matter where you are, you know, what you do. If you go to the United States as a student, if you go to the United States as a teacher or whatever, or go to any country, try to find things that are not related to your profession and do some volunteer work or do something like that and just get to know ordinary people. And then you get a different view, I think, of society. Yeah, you can see the nuances of life better. Let's just skip the social credit thing. Yeah, I think it makes writing a little less didactic. I think by didactic, I mean the journalists nowadays are always told, make a point. What's your point? You have to get to the point quickly, because you have to put everything on Twitter, right? In 140 strokes, or now it's 280 strokes, you get twice as much space. You have to be able to reduce everything, just like same thing on WeChat or something like that. You know, you're kind of limited. You got to grab people's attention. Best, don't write anything. Just put a photo up there. Make it Instagram. That's why Instagram is so popular, right? You don't even have to read, because most people, you know, it's just like, look at a photo. Oh, great. Wow, it's cool. Sunset or something like that. That's what, so you're told this over and over again. And this leads, I think, to journalism having always a very sharp angle. Like everything's got to be this way or that way. And I think, as we all know, reality is mostly made up of gray tones, not made up of only black and white. And I think that these kind of things can help out. And getting to a broader point, these were known in the United States as track 2 exchanges. So these are things that are not part of large geopolitical policy measures. This is not foreign ministers meeting. These are not journalists interviewing Zhu Rongji or some official or some dissident. These are person-to-person contacts that are meant to sort of become a force for stability in how countries interact with each other. So it isn't always dependent on government to government, which sometimes, as we know, especially in the past few years, governments can be quite erratic and kind of unstable. And they do one thing, they do another thing, and they then come to a lot of conflicts. If you have this foundation below it of person-to-person exchanges, this can help stabilize relations between countries. So even though on a personal level, you're not, you know, I didn't go and join this pilgrimage group to stabilize Sino-US relations, but it sort of has that effect collectively when you have millions of people doing that. And I think these are the kinds of things that are under threat nowadays. And I sort of say because they are rooted in reality, the last few words there. And this is, I think, nowadays a problem, because today, of course, we can all argue what is reality. Your reality is not my reality. But the idea that there are sort of facts, that there are knowable things that is coming more and more under threat. And so my question often, when I think about this, is does anyone want this anymore? We all say, oh yeah, we want that. We want to have nuance. Of course we want all that stuff. But people, in fact, do they really want that? Because people often don't read long articles. They don't subscribe to things. The moment you say, oh, there's a paywall, 90% of people are like, I want the free information, right? It's like, how many times have you done that? It's like, I do that too. Of course, when you're a student, maybe you don't have a lot of money, so it's understandable. But a lot of people also don't pay for stuff. So people want they sort of give lip service to these ideas. They want nuance, they want different things. But I don't know if collectively in society we really want that. It's almost like we want everything, perhaps because there's such looming crises over humanity, like the environment, these and other things, pandemics. People want to have sort of quick, clear answers to everything, when even these issues are not so simple to solve. So the problems with having reality or dealing with reality is that reality is messy. And reality does not fit into, as I was saying, the flame war mentality of social media. So social media has these, flame wars. It's basically, I got you, you get me, boom, 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 boom. Have a lot of back and forth. You're an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. This, that, and the other thing. That is constantly happening on social media. We know this. If you post something, you may get very strange reactions from people. But these are actually the posts that do the best. So if you want to have a lot of followers, the best thing is to post some completely outrageous claims. Okay, I'm sending something out by the, but actually, so it doesn't fit into the mentality of social media. I think current day politics is often driven by ideology more than pragmatism. We can see this especially in the Trump administration, but also in Beijing, where adherence to certain political norms are extremely important. And maybe we see this, I think we see this in other countries too, where these ideas are more important than reality. I just lived for 6 months in Britain. And in Britain, so many people supported Brexit because they just liked the idea of getting out of the EU. The EU is nonsense, all these rules and regulations. But when you actually ask people what were the details they didn't like, they could almost never tell you. They just had this sort of vague idea. And so I'm not sure exactly the reasons for this overall in the world, but it does seem like our global politics is becoming more ideological and less pragmatic. That pragmatism is seen as wishy-washy. It's something, as Donald Trump would say, it's for losers. Who needs pragmatism? I want clear answers. I'm going to solve the problem tomorrow. I just give you an example. When the US closed the Chinese consulate in Houston a few months ago, I put on Twitter, this is terrible. This is good. China will therefore close, in retaliation, China will definitely close a US consulate. I said probably Wuhan or Chengdu, and probably Chengdu because it's, well, anyways, I thought it would be probably Chengdu because Wuhan was where the virus was. They probably wouldn't close the consulate there. So in fact, they closed the Chengdu consulate. And then this guy, sort of I would say a bit of an ideologue, he wrote on my Twitter thing, he said, well, who cares about the Chengdu consulate? And I said, well, the Chengdu consulate was a window for the United States onto Western China. It was a window onto Tibet. It was a window onto this whole west of China. It's important to interact with people like that. Through the US consulate, many writers Chinese writers from Western China went to the United States, published in the United States indirectly through people at the consulate. So it was really valuable. And this guy's comment was, we don't need to know that. We need the right standpoint. So in other words, all this facts and this stuff you're talking about, we don't need that. All we need to know to analyze China is we need to have the right standpoint. And this kind of reminded me in the Cultural Revolution in China, people would be attacked for being an expert, or there would be this dichotomy: are you red, like Communist Party member, or are you expert? And so there's red or expert. I think nowadays people around the world want people who are red. They want people who have the right ideological standpoint without actually looking at the nuance and the complicated reality of the world. So moving on to some conclusions. I think my experience in China in the 1980s was that it was very open to many ideas. This was a time after the Cultural Revolution when there were all kinds of ideas percolating in China. There were people floating new kinds of political structures. The government was giving, for example, they had an idea of separating the Communist Party from the government. So you would have party members, but they wouldn't be the same as the people who ran the government. So just kind of like in sort of a democratic state, you could change the party without changing the government. And there were all kinds of ideas, but it was very hard to get around China. So China at that time, it was opening up. It was a fascinating time, but it was very hard to get to know China. It was still hard for foreigners, especially visible foreigners like me, somebody who really looks like a non-Chinese person, to travel around China, to even if you're in Beijing, to get onto a university campus and talk to people. Sometimes it was easier, sometimes it was harder, but it was a time of incredible ferment, but it was hard as a journalist to actually tap into that and report on that. I think in the 90s, even after Tiananmen, so Tiananmen clearly drew a line. There will be no political change. The Communist Party is staying in power. So but even in the 1990s, there were still a lot of other things that could be discussed. There were rural elections, grassroots democracy, village elections at least. I remember going out to villages that had elections. There were all kinds of different ideas like that. There were many different writers who were quite critical of things. The internet was just beginning to spread in China. And so writers like Wang Xiaobo, they published very critical books and essays on interesting websites or in publications around China. There was a lot of differentiation between regions of China. So when we were working in China in the 1990s, one of the things we would do is subscribe to different newspapers around China, because the newspapers were not online. So we would actually like subscribe to Yangcheng Wanbao, the sort of an evening newspaper from Guangzhou. We subscribed to it. 2 days later, it would appear in the office in Beijing. We'd open up, and, hey, what's happening in Guangzhou? We would like look through the newspaper like that. We didn't know. And then you see all kinds of interesting essays and stuff like that. So we would subscribe to 30 newspapers. We had every newspaper, Xizang Ribao, Tibet Daily, and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And the interesting Wanbao, the afternoon newspapers that were a little more open. So there was still a lot of ideas and differentiation between parts of China. And it became increasingly easy to travel. It wasn't that easy still, but it was getting easier and easier to travel around China. In the 2000s, I would say this was maybe like a golden age for being a journalist in China. There was a flowering of reporting due to of Chinese essays, intellectual life due to the internet. The party had not quite figured out how to completely control the internet, so there were still a lot of blogs and things like that, which is told actually really well in a novel published, I think, in 2004 by the writer from Wuhan. His name is Hu Fayun, and he wrote a book called Ruyan. It was translated in English as, it was about the SARS epidemic, the SARS pandemic. And it's about a woman, probably in Wuhan, it's not really clear which city, who's in her 50s or something, and her son goes overseas to study. And before he goes overseas to study, he gives her an internet connection. And he sets her up so she can read blogs. And so this is her introduction to the internet. And she begins to go online. And as the SARS epidemic is spreading, she gets all kinds of information about SARS that was not being censored. And this novel by Hu Faiyun is quite an interesting novel to tell of that era. And this is, so again, before the internet became so cleverly controlled by Beijing. And also there are a lot of people writing essays, publishing online. The newspapers were doing very interesting investigative work on different things. The Sun Zhigang case about a young man who got beaten to death by police because he didn't have the right ID papers. Those things were brought up by Chinese journalists and reported on, and caused sort of like a scandal inside China, and it changed policy inside China. So it was quite a different, interesting period. It was also same thing for foreign journalists. So foreign journalists can, of course, tap into that. You know, you can talk to these people, you can learn about China through all of this information coming at you from these different sources. It was also easy to travel, of course. High-speed rail was being built. The infrastructure in China, never easier to get around China. So I think it was kind of a golden age. Over the past 10 years, I think it's still really easy to travel, never easier. I mean, to get on a train, whoosh, high-speed rail, everywhere you want to go. I think now the ideas are not flourishing as much, but they're still surviving. And actually, so I think this is the same in the 2020s, that we have these ideas are, different ideas about how China should be run and so on are still surviving. They're certainly not flourishing, but there's increasing surveillance. And I wonder if what happened because sort of the pandemic and also the conflict between the Trump administration and the Xi administration, if this becomes the new norm. We had a huge number of journalists, including myself, who were expelled from China earlier this year. And I don't know if those people will ever go back. I mean, not individually go back, but I just mean those numbers of people will go back. Because at one point, there were about 10 journalists just for the New York Times, accredited in China. Now there's basically 1 or 2. And I don't know if they'll ever allow 10 people to work for the New York Times again. I think that those kind of open days are maybe gone. They might have been a legacy of the past. I'm not sure how many people will work there were definitely still be foreign journalists in China, but maybe not as many. And I think also the surveillance that we saw in the 2010s is continuing now. And a lot of it is kind of facilitated by the pandemic. A friend of mine, for example, said, living in a Chinese city, that he got some mail and it was opened. And his cleaning lady said, oh, of course, they have to open the mail because there could be virus inside the mail. So they have to check the mail to make sure it's clean. They clean it. And he's like, I don't think that's why they opened my mail. I think they opened my mail to look at my letter because they don't, and so that's the sort of thing I think but the pandemic normalizes a lot of this. Now, it used to be, it was kind of funny at the beginning of this year when China had this app for the pandemic, Western people were like, oh my God, Chinese people, I'll just show you this thing. Chinese people have an app on their phone that tells you where they're going. And so now, I don't know if you can see this, on my phone, living in the UK, I have an NHS app. And the NHS National Health Service in the UK has an app, and every time you go into a store, you scan the QR code. Every time you go into a bar or restaurant, you go anywhere, you scan the QR code. of course, it's quite easy for intelligence services, not just in China, but in the West, to then know where you're going, right? Of course, in some ways, our cell phones are tracking devices because they tell people where we're going. But these kind of things, I think it breaks down barriers, where people are now much more comfortable with the idea that, yeah, the government should know where I'm going because I want to stay healthy. So I think that makes it easier for governments to do that, and in China, but maybe around the world too. So with that, I'll stop. There are probably a lot of questions, and I'm happy to take any of them. I leave my contact information there. Actually, those cell phone numbers, forget, but you can always send me an email or something like that. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Alan, maybe.
Yes, thank you, Ian, for your sharing and your experience in China. I think, yeah, we can now open up to any questions you can ask and comment in the chat room, or if you just switch on your microphone and speak up. So maybe should I ask the first questions? I would like to know. So right now, so many foreign correspondents have left China. What will be the impact of China coverage in worldwide press?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this will speed up the trend toward more remote coverage of China, and also to concentration of coverage in certain media outlets. For example, as I mentioned, in the 1990s, I worked for the Baltimore Sun. At that time, the Baltimore Sun, Philadelphia Inquirer, Miami Herald, Chicago Tribune, they all had China correspondents. Now those newspapers don't have China correspondents anymore. There were more people in China, but it was concentrated at those big companies like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, AP, Bloomberg, the wire services. I think now that we have had a lot of those people expelled, it's going to mean overall less coverage and more remote coverage. So I see now, of course, the New York Times still writes about China, but a lot of their reporters are based in Taiwan or South Korea. The people who are expelled are not allowed to work in Hong Kong. That was part of the expulsion order. But, and I think that this is problematic, obviously. I think you get, when I mentioned that advice from the Wall Street Journal editor, spend one more day and just go out and look at stuff. You can't do that. You can't spend any day in China now. You can't. So the idea that you go in with a fixed idea, I'm going to do a story, for example, about schools opening in China after the pandemic, and everything has to be on the telephone or sending in messages and stuff like that. Of course, that's not the fault of the journalist, but I think it leads to a warping in coverage. But I think it is a part of, I think a lot of people are comfortable with that. At the high point of coverage of China around the Olympics, The Atlantic had somebody based, this is a big magazine in the United States, a prestigious magazine. They had somebody based in China. The New Yorker had somebody based in China, and some other publications as well. And now fewer of these people do, and people are more comfortable having people maybe just fly in to do a story or something like that. Or this idea that I can figure out what's going on, especially magazines like to do this. I can figure out what's going on by Twitter and all this stuff, and not just like fly in for a week and do the article and then leave. I think that that's not a good way to do journalism. That's a bad way. I mean, that's parachute journalism. Some people say it in a positive sense. To me, parachute journalism was always the worst kind of journalism. It's a necessity maybe in a war zone. If you're having a war, there's a war going on, you don't have a chance to spend a lot of time talking to people because there's guns and all this sort of stuff. But if you're covering a country, the things that really matter are often the long-term trends in a country. And I think we miss those when we're looking at things from afar. So.
Yeah. Any questions from all of you? Yeah.
I've got a question.
You just switch on your microphone. Unmute.
Hi, I've got a question. Maybe you can say the name when you pick someone.
Yes, and Angel.
Yes, yes. Thanks. Thanks. Hi, Ian. Greetings from Kuala Lumpur. I see that you take like really good photographs. I'm just wondering what's your opinion about journalists these days having to balance good journalism and also do photojournalism at the same time, because a lot of these journalists are now equipped with smartphones, and then you don't get the privilege of having photojournalists following you around anymore. Thanks.
Yeah, well, most of those photos that I took, the good photos, are not taken by me. They're taken by a professional photographer. So my phone snaps look like most people's phone snaps, which are not all that good because I'm not a professional photographer. I have a lot of respect for photojournalism, and I think it's as high as print journalism. And I think it's a completely different skill set. I remember when I did my first article for National Geographic, I said, it was on the Grand Canal, and I said, oh, I'm going to go to the Grand Canal. When is the photographer coming? Should we go together? And they were like, no, you're not going to go with the photographer. The photographer is going to go on his own. And I said, yeah, but he can't take pictures of what I'm seeing. He doesn't care. A good photographer isn't going to just follow around a print journalist and take a picture. Oh, you interview that person? Snap, snap. Who cares? This is like boring pictures anyways, right? A good photojournalist will try to do a reportage of a place based on what that person sees, not based on what the print person does. So, I mean, I think unfortunately, no, you're right, that a part of cost cutting is that everybody is supposed to take a picture. Obviously, phones have gotten better. You can take a good picture with an iPhone. iPhone has a big advertising campaign to try to convince us that we can take fantastic photos with it. But the reality is that it's not the technical thing. It's actually the skill in the person who's taking the photo and what they're trying to say and what they mean. That's what makes great photojournalism. So, I mean, if you have to do that, I don't know what to say. I mean, I think it's probably the best thing is take a course in photojournalism or read up. It's the same. It's like if a photojournalist had to go write an article. You know, I mean, sometimes people do that, but it's not ideal. People work at different paces. See, that's the other thing. A photojournalist, like this one guy who's wanted to do the thing on the Grand Canal I mentioned, Mike Yamashita, and a Japanese-American photographer, he had this one photo in his mind he really wanted to take. He says, this lake in the Grand Canal, and these guys are going to be fishing at daybreak, and I want to get a photo of the sun rising, and they get the fish out. And I'm like, I don't care about that. I'm not going to wait all day for some fisherman to like pull a fish out of the water, right? And so sometimes when you see photographers and journalists work together, they're often in conflict because the one will say, I'm finished here. Like the photojournalist will look and go, nothing interesting for me here. I'm going somewhere else. Whereas the journalist is like, no, I want to spend an hour talking to that person. And the photojournalist is completely uninterested in that. At the same time, the photojournalist may say, oh, this is great. I got to wait for the light to change. I got to wait for the sun to move over there. And the print journalist is like, I don't want to do that. Like, I've got to go interview other people. So it's quite different needs. It's the same with video. It's a completely different form of storytelling. It's the same, you know, if you think of it like in the arts, we don't expect a novelist to make movies, right? Why should we expect a print journalist to make video? You know, it requires different kinds of skill sets and it's not just a technical thing of how to use the camera. You have to tell the story differently. I mean, you can learn it, but it's different.
Yeah. Thank you, Ian. I saw that Nicholas raised your hand, right? You have a question?
Oh, yes. Okay. One short question from me, being in the same position as you have been a couple of years before. I'm currently a student at Beijing Daxue and conduct my first interviews with people in China. It's the first time I'm encountering the problem with that. Of course, many topics, even topics in fields that you wouldn't consider, are considered sensitive. What is your strategy to figure out what questions you may ask, which question you don't want to ask people? How do you deal with sensitivity?
Yeah, it depends how much time you have, because I don't mean now, but it means how much time you have when you're interviewing a person. Because the ideal thing is you build trust over time. this is also a problem with the parachute journalist. The parachute journalist who comes in just to do a specific story goes in with one idea, executes it, and leaves. Kind of like a parachutist goes in, does that, leaves. And that's not a good way you build trust. Then you get a certain kind of person who will talk to you, a talking head or a very predictable person. But the people who maybe have a sensitive story, they need time to talk to you. And I mean, obviously, when you then spend time with the person may consider you their friend. And then you have an ethical issue. Are you clear that you are interviewing the person? You have to make clear all the time, this is going to be an interview. This is we may be friends, but I'm also doing an article. Or maybe you have to go back to them and say, you said this and this, is that okay if I use it in my article? I think that's often a problem with people, or not a problem, but it's an issue with people who are not who are not used to being interviewed. So of course, if you talk to a politician or some famous academic who always gives interviews, they know we're on the record or off the record or what these things mean. But maybe an ordinary person will tell you something, and essentially it's off the record, right? They're telling you about their personal life. Now, if you then go write about their personal life in the newspaper, they may be quite shocked and upset. So I think you have to be very clear about the ground rules and then go back to the person and always, take into account your interviewee's safety and concerns, because the worst thing that can happen to you is you could be expelled from a country, but that person may ruin their life or something like that. So you always have to think that should always be your prime consideration.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is Professor Fang raising your hand?
Yes.
Yeah, your turn.
Yeah. Thanks, Ian. So I'm Kucheng. I'm now teaching at CUHK journalism school. I used to be a journalist at Nanfang Zhoumo, Shenzhen Weekly. So my question might be a little bit cliched, but I guess many people are interested in that. That is, have you ever felt disillusioned during recent years? Because we want to promote mutual understanding and demonstrate nuance, but as you said, people are not interested in that anymore. And also journalism itself is in deep financial crisis, no money, and you even yourself got kicked out of China, right? So are you disillusioned? And the related question is, what is your suggestion to journalism students who are not entering into industry in its golden age? Thanks.
Well, I don't know if I'm disillusioned. I mean, I guess I saw what was happening. That was the reason I left the Wall Street Journal in 2010. I don't want to criticize the Wall Street Journal too much. It's still a good newspaper. I think, but that golden age was coming to an end there because it was no longer owned by a family and was being owned by a big corporation. And obviously they have different interests and concerns. So that was pretty clear. The writing was on the wall there. And in terms of Sino-US relations, yeah, I am, of course, disappointed with how things have developed and with the overall atmosphere. Those people I mentioned, I showed the pictures of the 9 people I showed the interviews I'd done before. Many of them are in difficulty now. They can't get published. And so it is an extremely trying and difficult time for journalists in China, public intellectuals in China. But, in terms of what my advice would be to journalists, I get asked that question quite a bit, and it's a difficult one. I have to just say, when I entered journalism in the 1980s, so a long time ago, people were telling me similar things. People also said, oh, the golden age of journalism is past. That was Watergate, and there was more money in the past, and television is going to destroy newspapers. Everyone just watches television. Nobody reads newspapers, and et cetera, et cetera. That, of course, didn't really happen. And obviously, the internet is it is a real challenge. The newspapers are really going down. I do think that there will always be a need for people to tell other people what's going on in the world in some form. there will always be a need for people to go out into the world and describe to the best of your capabilities what's going on out there and to bring that back to your audience. I don't think that is past. I think there will just be different forms. I think the challenge now is writing for blogs and so on that don't pay very much money. And I think the business model is broken. I don't think there's an easy solution, but I do think that there still is a need for it. In terms of a career, if you're a young journalist, you could always say, hey, I'll try it for 5 years and see what happens. In fact, throughout my career, a lot of people, there are always break-off points when people quit journalism. A lot of people start as a journalist and they think it's cool. I can go write articles. I like to write articles. I like to see the world. Every day's new or something like that. They have these, ideas. And then, and they go out, and then after a while they go, the pay is terrible. Even in the 1980s, the pay was never great. The pay's terrible. There's no prestige. Every day I have to beg people to talk to me, especially if you're kind of like a stuck-up person and you want people to ask you, and you feel, it's too tiring. I don't want to be a journalist anymore. So by their late 20s, they make a quick change. They say, I'm going to go to grad school and become a lawyer, something like that. And this is like a big, typical changing period. And then later, maybe 10 years later, in the late 30s, people then quit because they have or mid 30s, they have a family. And they're like, oh my God, I've got a kid, I've got this, I got that. I can't afford to be a journalist because the pay is so terrible. So then they quit and become an investment banker or something like that. And then, then you get people who don't quit but are fired later. And when you're 50, then you become redundant. Oh, you're too expensive and you're healthcare and you're sick all the time. Here's a buyout. See you later. So you can quit or be fired. That's your future as a journalist. But I mean, I guess my point is, I would still say to a young person, you can go and do a few years of journalism and see if you can't make a living, then you can try something else. The skills you learn as a journalist are quite useful. That's actually why a lot of people go into law and other things like that, because you learn to ask questions, you learn to write quickly, you learn to analyze things quickly. I mean, it's not always the best analysis, it's not the best writing, but a lot of people can't write anything. So in almost any profession, having a few years of journalism will help you later down the road. So I would say it's still worth trying. If it doesn't work out, you can still take that skill set and go somewhere else.
Thank you. I think we can take some questions from the chat room. I saw that Kenneth Wong asked, and Ian shared us some tips about how to cover China well when one cannot be in China. And it seems like under the pandemic or for Hong Kong journalists, the national security law, it is difficult for many people to travel to China. And how can we report from afar? What is the best way?
That's a good question. I don't think there's really a good way. I think there's sort of a least bad way. I think ideally, if you're writing from afar, you have been to the place already and lived there. I mean, so I think like the journalists who just got expelled, many of them have contacts, they have knowledge about China. They've been there. They can think in their mind the way the country is. They can maybe think, they can test the hypothesis in their mind because they know China. But if you've never been to China and you can't get into China, then I think it's going to be quite difficult. Obviously the best way, like for any article, is to talk to as many people as possible and not always the obvious people. I think the problem all journalists face, because journalists are always under time pressure, but the problem is that people tend to go to the same analysts over and over again, the same talking heads, the same political scientists. Oh, I need one person on this side. Oh, I need one person on that side. I'll talk to A, I'll talk to B, and that's it, And I understand there's a lot of pressure. You got to get the article out quickly, but if you can find time and talk to more people, it's always better, no matter where you are or what you're doing.
Yes, and
that's basic journalism, I guess. Yeah.
And I saw that S. We have an audience call himself or herself S, and he wanted to ask do you have any advice to journalists who work in the media where editors push really hard on deadlines? And I think I agree with S that, well, spend one more day seems like a fairy tale nowadays. But what can we do if our editor push us to do it in one day, within one day, and they don't give us any resources? If we don't want to quit it, what can we do? Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I guess you have to always push. You always have to fight with editors. Most of the time they don't tell you. Even in the golden age, whatever that was, they never gave you the extra day. You always have to fight, I think, to get more time, because editors always think a story can be done quickly, and it's never like that. But then editors always think that, oh, journalists in the field are always trying to make things too complex. And it's not really that complicated. Come on, just hurry up and do it. I think it's a negotiation. You just have to push back and do the best you can.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think there's any great, there's no great solution.
And I saw that, Gigi, want to ask you, do you agree that journalists should be neutral in political terms, or is it possible or impossible for a journalist to be without stance? Question on neutrality, is it possible?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess there are two kinds of journalism. Well, there's many kinds of journalism, but there is definitely a kind of journalism called advocacy journalism. And advocacy journalism makes very clear, I am going to write this to help right a wrong in society. I see there's a problem and I'm going to write about it. And this is, of course, has a long tradition. Many journalists have done this over the decades, over the centuries. They go out to show the terrible working conditions of coal miners in an area. They want to expose government malfeasance and so on. It's hard when you do that to be objective. Of course, nobody, as we all know, nobody is perfect, is objective. We all have our biases. I think the difference is that you can try to balance. You should be aware of your biases. You should be aware of what your views are, but you try to then take that into account when you're writing, or balance it out by talking to different kinds of people. It doesn't mean there's always two sides to the story, that the other side has the same weight as the other side. It's not, if you're talking to the owner of a coal mine who has a really dangerous coal mine and workers are dying, that person's side of the story is not equally true, or it's true, but it's not equally as the people who are dying. I mean, you have to sort of stand up for the people. But I think the more convincing way is to be as objective as possible. If you're writing with a clear agenda, your readers will not really believe you, because they can tell you're not really you're not even trying to be objective. I think readers sense that. I mean, it's a debate, for example, in mainstream media in the United States today. Take the New York Times, for example. When they talk about Trump, they often say he tells lies. And they say he told this lie. And this was a lie, and that was a lie. And of course, they might well be lies, or they're not true. But if you always use that language, it's hard to convince people who are maybe unsure. It may be better to say, Trump said this, however, his health experts said that. And then the reader can kind of decide if that's a lie or not a lie. You don't always have to sort of label everything. I think it's more convincing that way. Of course, you choose to tell that story. You choose to point that out. That shows maybe your bias, but at least to try to give readers the tools to understand a situation. I mean, the problem I think now is, it's always been a problem in society, but the problem in journalism, in academia, also people are always writing for their own group of people, their own tribe. They're preaching to the choir. They're not convincing anybody. So this is, of course, you feel good. Trump's a liar. Okay, good. You feel good. But have you convinced anybody? Probably not.
And is there anyone here would like to voice out your questions? Otherwise, I will continue to repeat the questions from the chat room. Okay, Emily, your turn.
Thanks, Ian, for today's brilliant talk. I have a question from the standpoint of an international journalism who knows Chinese society well. What suggestions do you have for selecting topics for international news about today's China? I have done several New York Times report. Most of their report of China are negative with a stereotype. However, maybe for the generation of us, we need to do more diverse topic to let the world know the real China. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very complex question, because I wrote about this in an essay that ran in the New York Review of Books a few years ago, that journalists are trained to write about bad news. And when you are trained as a journalist, you're, I think I give this example in a previous talk, but if you write about a bridge that does not collapse, people will think that's not a story, right? If you write about a bridge that does collapse, that's the story. So it's not the bridge that doesn't collapse. But of course, that's true, especially if you're writing for a domestic audience. I think that's truer, because a domestic audience will understand the context. So your domestic audience will understand, hey, most bridges don't collapse. So in my town, so if he's writing about this bridge that collapses, then it must be a big problem, right? But if you're writing for an audience thousands of miles away, and you write, your only coverage is bridge collapses in China, high-speed rail accident in China, a chemical leak in China, then people back in the United States will think, God, China is a land of disasters. Bridges are collapsing, railway disasters, chemical leaks, and they won't understand the broader context. But journalists are trained to write about those problems in society, to uncover problems in society. But I think when they're covering foreign countries, they have to take a little bit more of an ethnographic approach. And yes, you need to talk about problems in society for sure, but you should also try to do a few other stories. Journalists will often very defensively say, oh, but we wrote about the wonderful high-speed rail in China. Yeah, you wrote one article 5 years ago about that, and then you wrote all these other articles that were not about that. Or we wrote about a rich business person in China. We don't need to emphasize that too much. But if you write about, one rich person and then you write about 20 poor people, I think the impression that people will get is that China is a country of poor people. They won't really understand the growing middle class in China and things like that. It's a challenge because you have to make those stories interesting. People also, readers don't want to read, oh, there's some boring, prosperous, stable, middle class family in China. Oh, it's not very interesting to read. I think I'll read something else about a bridge collapsing. So, you have to find a way to make this interesting, but it is always a challenge, especially when covering foreign countries, that you have to try to show the bigger trends. But this of course, should not be an excuse to ignore problems in society.
But do you think that, a follow-up question, do you think that reporting bad things is a Western tradition of journalism? Because I think many people in China are arguing about this, that journalism acting as a warning system of the society is a Western idea. What do you think about that?
Well, it's it's a new idea in that it probably only has existed for 100 years or something like that. I don't think it's a uniquely Western idea. I think you see the media play a similar function in non-Western countries, like India, and parts of Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, other parts of East Asia. The media plays this role also. I don't think it's uniquely a Western idea. So.
Yeah. Any other questions from the the microphone. And I think there are many mainland journalists here or potential journalists here. And I think Sophie Wu is asking a question. She's asking for as young journalists working for China's state-owned media and struggling with the difficulties on practicing professionalism. Do you have any thoughts or any advice for them?
Well, being a journalist nowadays in China is very challenging. So I think it's a difficult time, but I would keep reporting and keep trying to do the best you can. Somebody asked me this question once before, and I said, you know, sometimes you can't publish everything you want right away, but the biggest mistake we make is to assume that the status quo will never change. But the status quo always changes. And so what seems now to be immovable and unchangeable will change with time. And if you can't publish, if you have something you've reported and you can't publish it and you have difficulty with it, you may be able to find other outlets. You may later find that you can publish it as a book, or, you know, so it's still worth trying. But I can definitely see, I know from my friends who are journalists in China, that it's definitely the most trying time right now to keep up professional standards.
Mm-hmm. Any questions from the floor? And of course, there are many other questions in the chat room. I'm now, so we don't have much more time. I would like Ian to take more questions from
Look at the chat room.
our audience. Anyone want to ask anything? No? Then I will ask a question from Wenjin. So he would like you, he is asking whether you could share a news story you have done in China that is the most unforgettable or interesting to you.
The most unforgettable.
Too many, right?
Well, yeah, I haven't. Well, I can tell you one weird story that ended up being, it's kind of funny, was I had when I was working at the Baltimore Sun, I was interested in Chinese spiritual religious practice, and there's all these books that were being published about people who had superhuman powers or special powers, 特异功能, and these people who had special powers, like they could read a book with their ear, you know, so they could pick up a copy of the London Review of Books and stick it to their ear, and they could read the newspaper and say, I can tell you everything that's inside that magazine. And there's a whole, and the other one guy, so I said, I want to do a story about this. This is like just sort of funny. And so I went and interviewed this guy. Another guy said, see, I can stick my finger in the electric socket in the wall, and it's no problem for me. See, I'm fine. And I've got special powers. I can control electricity and all that. It's like really strange people. And so I wrote an article about this, but it was kind of a missed opportunity because this was part of, and I only realized it later, but there was sort of a funny side of it, but there was also these Qigong masters were actually becoming very influential in China. And this sort of led to a mini, almost like a religious revival in the 1990s of people who were searching for values and searching for new things to believe in after the Cultural Revolution. And it led to, of course, the Falun Gong movement and that upheaval, which I later did cover. But at the time, it was just a funny story, and I don't know what the point of it. I guess the point is that you should always be willing to keep an open mind when writing articles. And sometimes the articles that sometimes seem funny are sometimes not just funny, but they also represent something deeper. And maybe I sort of missed that at the time, but I just thought it was a funny article. But if I had to do that over again, I think I would have taken that more seriously, and not just to see the funny side of it, but why did people believe in these special powers? I mean, these were educated, intelligent people. Even Tsinghua University had somebody studying, had a laboratory studying qi. Can you fa qi? Can you send out qi from your hand? Like that. And you know, like people, they say, oh yeah, you can. We measured it on some sort of microscope or something like that, some special thing, electromagnetic field. And it's kind of funny, like that Tsinghua University would be studying this. I didn't look at the deeper question would be why? Why was there this desire for this? And I think you can kind of think of it in terms of modernization, that China was abandoning communism, was taking up capitalism, and maybe people were looking for something special, indigenous to believe in. And this presented itself, even if nobody believes in that nowadays, of course. But I don't know. A strange story.
Thank you. Any questions?
I have a question, if I may. Yeah. So thank you very much, Ian. I am here also a professor at the school, and I'm curious because you're doing a PhD now, from what I've read on your bio. So I'm curious about what has led you to do this PhD, and what are you hoping to do with the research that comes out of it?
I've always benefited a lot from academics, for academia and people who studied China. I always thought that academics were, in a good way, the opposite of journalists, because they could spend a long time researching a subject. So whenever I wanted to research a subject, I always made a point of talking to academics in that field, you know, health, or that article I mentioned before on psychiatry in China. And so when I was working on the souls of China, I guess I had this idea of working on a PhD for quite a while as a way to look a little more deeply into some topic in China. And when I wrote the book, The Souls of China, there's one storyline which is about these pilgrimage associations. In Chinese, these are xiang, like incense, xiang hui, pilgrimage associations. And these pilgrimage associations are sort of civil society organizations in China. I'm looking at the Beijing area because I just lived there longer and know it better. And so I wrote about them, but just one pilgrimage association and in more of a reportage way. But I thought, well, this is a really interesting topic. No one is really, there's been a lot of work done on these holy mountains around Beijing, like Miaofangshan, going back 100 years, but just looking at these associations a little more in depth. And I had gathered a lot of material, so I decided to do a deeper look at that. And I don't know what the benefit, I mean, I will write a book about it. I don't know what the benefit will be. At my age, I'm too old to start a whole new career in academia or get a tenured professorship in Chinese studies or religious studies. But I think having the PhD will be just interesting for me to go through that different way of looking at it and becoming more familiar with the theoretical discussions around topics. I think sometimes journalists tend to downplay theory, and they tend to say, there's no such thing as theory. All you need to know are the facts. Just really find the facts and you will know what the truth is. But of course, how you choose the facts, what they are, what the bigger issues are in society, sometimes journalists miss that. And so personally, I think it will be interesting. And then maybe I can do more teaching with a PhD also. I think it will maybe open some doors for teaching in the future. But I won't become a tenured professor, you know, in Chinese religious studies or something.
And you're doing it in Leipzig, I read. That's the city that I grew up in. So I found it. Really
yes, because Leipzig, there's a professor there, Philip Klart, and I've known him for a long time. He's quite well known in the field of Chinese religious studies. And I talked with him for quite a number of years about doing this, and he was very encouraging. And then he agreed to sponsor me and be my advisor, my doctor. Yeah.
Yes, and one related questions from the chat room. C asked you, do you know that the entry of your book, The Souls of China?
Oh, I just see that.
Yeah, you read it, right?
I just see it was deleted on Douban and then reappeared.
You know what happened?
I don't know what it means. Maybe the CCP realizes I'm Guojiyoren, I'm an international friend. No, I don't think you can buy my book on Douban. I tell you, there's a guy who translated my book into Chinese. in mainland China, and a nice guy, just a hobby translator. And he just took my book and then translated it into Chinese without asking. And meanwhile, through a Taiwan publisher, I did an official translation, which is different, which was important for me because the people speaking are Chinese. I recorded them, obviously, transcribed them into Chinese. So when I did the Chinese version, I wanted their original words. So a guy talking in Beijing, like a working class guy, he's talking Beijing Hua, and a guy in Sichuan is talking Sichuan. So this is in their original words. But this guy who translated it just like picked up my English book and just started translating the whole thing into standard Mandarin. So it loses, the words are retranslated back into Chinese. They're not really accurate. And then he just took the cover and he just pirated the cover art and then did a bound version and was selling that on Douban in Chinese. I don't care, it's fine because the book can't be sold in China anyway. I just think it's a pity because that's not entirely accurate, that translation, because it's not really, I had different things, original documents that I was citing from, and I gave all that to the translator in Taiwan. I gave the original material to the translator in Taiwan so they could incorporate the original material. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think it mattered. I think some people put stuff up on Douban, right? And then it gets taken down and it gets put up and it gets taken down. I don't think there's like millions of people buying my book anyway. So I don't think it really matters.
So shall we take the last two questions? Anyone has more questions?
I have a question. Hi, everyone. My name's Cody, and I actually went to Beida for my master's a couple years ago at Yanqing Academy. And somebody sent this event's link. So I thank you guys for inviting us. I had a really question for Ian. I think this question of truth is so important nowadays. And I did a little bit of work with CNN in Beijing a few years back. And I have so many Chinese friends. And I'm sure, Ian, you have a lot of Chinese friends too. Local Chinese who maybe read some global news, probably read some like domestic news, or obviously have to read that a lot. And I'm just wondering, when you're talking to your Chinese friends and they know you're a journalist, right, and they read some stuff of yours, or they read international news, what are their perspectives? Because a lot of times I have a Chinese friend who's a journalist. I have friends who read news of different sources, and they tend to always be more supportive of the Chinese narrative, no matter how open-minded they seem to be. I'm always a little bit surprised that they're quite skeptical, especially of the most critical Western news, human rights related, of course, Xinjiang, these types of issues. And they say, well, of course the West is going to report like that. Of course, but that's not the truth, right? What is the truth is what the Chinese Communist Party is saying for the most part. I'm always surprised when they say this to me because, we've been friends for years. And so I guess I'm wondering, and I think I actually participated in a talk of the New York Times bureau chief too. And he mentioned that most people in China are very negative opinions of the New York Times, but occasionally they'll say, oh, the New York Times is good. So what is your general opinion of like the local Chinese and of Western media? And is there ever a time, I guess the follow-up question, that you feel like the Western media doesn't, actually purports inaccurately about something, and that we have to also be a little bit more skeptical about Western media coverage in China?
Yeah, I think it's human nature to think that there are always two sides to a story, and that not everything can be wrong that you're reading. So if you're reading about, say, the New York Times has an article on the camps in Xinjiang, and then meanwhile you're also reading about how this is purely for re-education, it's just to fight terrorism, and it's a good thing for Uyghur people, and that's your main source of information. I think it's human nature to sort of say, well, the truth must be in between. Yeah, maybe it's a little too heavy-handed, but it's probably also a good thing. And that's sort of human nature, is to sort of say, well, there must be two sides to the story. And so I think that's maybe part of the reaction that people have when they deal with the foreign media when they think about foreign media, that they think, well, the government's point of view must be true also. But yeah, I think it's hard also because people don't really read. They don't really read the media, right? When they talk about the foreign media, they're rarely actually reading the article critically, or even reading the article, period. They've just heard some version of it that, the New York Times is reporting blah, blah, blah. Isn't that, and then they sort of think that, but they rarely will be reading it. I think it's the same, we get the same thing domestically in the United States, for example, when people will say, it's funny, even the Wall Street Journal editorial page will say, the media is reporting, and it's always sort of like, there's this liberal elitist media that's reporting blah, blah, blah about Trump, but it's not true. And so then people in the United States, a lot of people, ordinary people sort of go, well, the media is reporting that Trump didn't pay his taxes, but who knows really, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, maybe he didn't pay enough, but a lot of people don't pay enough. And they don't really believe, they don't really go in, even if they could go get the New York Times and read it, but they don't read it. And so even in that situation where you have an optimal flow of information, people don't even bother to do that because they sort of want to sort of have it both ways. And then so all these revelations about Trump not paying his taxes, for example, doesn't even resonate among Americans. It's not an election issue, right? Even though it's clearly been proven that he's been cheating on his taxes. It's unbelievable for years and years and years. It doesn't even factor in the election. How much more so in China where information is limited and stuff. I think people have preconceived notions and it's hard to break free of that. So people, grow up thinking, the PLA liberated Tibet in 1950 and just put down this rebellion in 1958. It was a good thing. China's brought roads and development. And before that, it was a terrible theocracy. And, that's what people grow up thinking. So I think it's hard to convince people otherwise. But it's the same with a lot of Americans. They can't believe that a statue of Robert E. Lee should be taken down, right? They go and protest against that, even though anybody in America can find out that Robert E. Lee was fighting to keep slavery. Yeah, I'm pessimistic about human nature and changing people's minds, maybe.
Pessimistic. Any more questions?
May I ask a question, please?
Oh, Kit.
Yeah.
You ask yourself.
Oh, sure.
It's difficult for me to repeat.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Johnson. Recently there is a movie, Mr. Jones, and it seems to portray two kinds of reporters in former USSR, which is on an authoritarian regime. On one hand, there may be reporters who work with the system or quote unquote collude with the system, and they write stories which are typical and in line with the government, and even cover up some stuff. And on the other hand, there might be reporters who do not work with the system, and they would write about the truth, and they take a lot of risk personally or professionally. Do you think that this is the case in China, and is it going to be the trend in Hong Kong? And if so, what are your advice for reporters, please?
Yeah, I think it's already the case in China that there are people who are taking a lot of risks not to publish things that are different. But it's the main thing in China. I haven't seen the movie, so I don't know exactly. But China is not like the USSR in the sense that most of the time the government is effective in simply making people irrelevant. It's not so much that they do sometimes, right? Arrest people. We read about that. Arrest people and throw them in jail. But most of the time, what they do is simply sideline them. That you have no outlet. Nobody can read your stuff. You have no WeChat account. You have no Weibo account. You have no way. So even if you got all this great information, what are you going to do, right? You can't reach anybody anymore. You can think of it like Ai Weiwei, right? So at some point, he was in the 2000s, he was quite influential in China. He was criticizing the government about the Sichuan earthquake and the response. He was criticized by the government, and people, were supporting him and took packets of money and threw it over the wall into his house to pay for lawyer fees. And all this exciting stuff, interesting. He made a movie, he went to blah, 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 did all this stuff. And then the government, they detained him briefly, but they primarily made him irrelevant in China by making him kind of like a non-person. So he basically lives abroad, has his shows abroad. He's in the international media, But in China, my impression is that nobody really pays any attention to Ai Weiwei. So I think this is the way that happens more commonly, that that the government is, and then after a while, you can't make a living doing this either. If you can't work at a media organization, your WeChat post, sometimes you can pay if you like a WeChat post, and some journalists can make some money doing that. But if nobody can read your WeChat post, or it's immediately taken down, you can't make any money that way, then you have to sort of think, I need to support my family. I need to make a living, right? And then what do I do? And so people then leave the field. So I think that's probably what will happen more likely, that people just have a harder time staying in the field if they want to do that kind of journalism. I suspect it'll be the same in Hong Kong also. I mean, there'll probably be some people who insist on writing these things will be detained. And then after a while, most people are going to be, I'm not going to be a martyr. Most people are not martyrs in the world, right? Most people are not going to go to jail. They maybe go to jail once, but they're not going to want to go back to jail. So maybe 10 days or something is enough, and that's it, or something. And so I think that's a pretty effective way of dealing with things, and that's what they've done.
Yeah. Before we end, I think there is a related question in the chat room. I would like to ask Ian. That is, of course, we are encountering some very difficult situation in the field of journalism, and many students seem to be planning a path of freelancing. So you are very experienced in freelancing, and they would like to know more advice from you how to be a freelancer.
Oh, right. Well, I wish I had a definite answer. I think I remember when I was going to go freelancing in 2010, 10 years ago or something like that. I have an agent who helps me sell books to publishers. And my agent was, don't become a freelancer. He said, oh my God, your work at the Wall Street Journal, they have a American Express credit card they give you, right? And you can go and go to dinner for free. He says, don't become a freelancer. And I was like, that doesn't matter. But actually, being a freelancer is rather difficult. A lot of people who are, and one of the funny things he told me, I said, I could try to write for the New Yorker, and New Yorker pays a lot of money. And he says, let me tell you, he said he started to list the people who write for the New Yorker. And most of the people who write for the New Yorker, maybe not some of the people you're thinking of, Peter Hessler or Evan Osnos, but most of the people who write for the New Yorker have other jobs. They're a professor at a university, or they're independently wealthy, or they have a very wealthy spouse who pays the bills. And writing becomes something they can do in their spare time. And maybe it's their full-time job, but they don't rely on it to get a pension and stuff like that. I think freelancing can be good, but it's very hard to make a real living as a freelancer for the long term. Maybe out of college, you can do it for a few years, but then, and I know when you're young, you don't think of these things, but if you think of pension, healthcare, and then later, if you have a child or something like that, who's going to pay for the schooling, education costs? Life starts getting very expensive, and you begin to realize that the freelancing may bring you glory, like, I'm blogging for this magazine or that thing, and I'm getting a lot of likes on Twitter and all that, but actually being able to make a living off that is very difficult. I don't want to discourage everyone and say there's no way to do it, but it's a pretty tough way to make a living. I think it can work if you're able to do several things. It's like a jigsaw. It's like a puzzle with lots of different pieces. You sell some articles here. Maybe you get some grant money to do things. You also maybe teach or do something else on the side, maybe where there's some synergy. But it's hard unless you're at a very high level, very popular, like say Peter Hessler, who's a freelancer basically. Very popular, his books sell well. You can't really make a living long-term as a freelancer, I think. Anyway, I don't mean to be pessimistic, but it's hard. Try it. See what you think. And then go become a lawyer afterwards. Go to law school.
Yeah, we can always change field. So thank you very much, Ian. Before I forget, actually, this event is co-organized by the Chinese University Press and also the School of Journalism and Communication in CUHK. And yeah, this is the hard-selling time. Actually, Ian Johnson is one of the contributors of this book with the name Wittgenstein, One-Way Ticket and Other Unforeseen Benefits of Studying Chinese. Really long title, but this is a very interesting book about foreigners or expatriates, how they learn Chinese and how they use Chinese in China. So there are a lot of interesting story about cultural exchange. So there are two versions of this book, English and Chinese. So you can buy this book in the bookshop in CUHK, or you can buy it online. So I think thank you, Ian, for spending the night with us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great.
Thank you, Ian. I think I hope you have a good time in Singapore.
Yeah, I will. It's warmer.
And good rest for your quarantine.
Yes, 2 weeks in a hotel. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Bye-bye,
thank you, our audience. And I would like to remind you for our audience, we have the second lecture on, let me look at it will be the second lecture will be on the 13th of November at 7 p.m. So the guest speaker will be the general manager of brand insights and marketing communications from Cathay Pacific Airways, Mr. Edward Bell. And he will talk about the year that flew by, understanding the COVID-19 challenge for aviation. I think it is a very timely talk on the crisis of global aviation, and we have the general manager of Cathay Pacific to tell us how they are coping with this crisis. So I hope to see you all on November 13th. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks.